2021, where he works as wildfire research scientist. Most of his work focuses on understanding the impact of wildfires, both positive and negative. Okay, this is a good part or bad part of fire on watershed functioning and the water supply in Canada. So that's a really brief, short bio. In fact, Dr. Robinne and I work with UFLO and on a forest water task force. This actually, we know each other. So today here, talk about wildfires risks to water security in Canada from baseline information to sustainable action. Sounds a very, very interesting topic, and it's highly relevant to us, and particularly in BC interior. Francois, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Adam, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation as well. So let me share my screen. All right, let's go. Is everybody seeing that okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, well, so let's get started on, yes, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much for attending today. And so yeah, we'll talk about wildfire risks to water security in Canada. And I've been working on this topic for pretty much the past 9 years now. And I'm really hopeful that I can convey this, some sense of interest, and diversity in this topic, but also like how timely and important it is right now in Canada to work on this question. So I'll walk you guys through, this outline, and like this talk, it's probably around like 45, 50 minutes. And I will start with, some sort of background knowledge, going through some definitions and what is the state of water security, forests and fires in Canada, going through what I mean by watershed wildfire risks, so WWR, a little bit about, like how to create baseline information related to wildfire and water resources in Canada, and how it is important for drinking water, especially, and what are some possible solutions for the long term, especially like focusing on. I will use the word watershed rewilding. What are the options to actually make our watersheds a bit healthier? So yes, let's get it started and talk a little bit about water security, forests, and fires. So water security, that's a situation where that's conditions in which people, communities, ecosystem can actually safely access the right quantity of water. Sorry, I'm restarting that. Water security, this is the potential, the possibility to access safe, affordable, and sustainable amounts of water of a good quality to sustain, the capacity of ecosystems, individuals, and society to thrive on a daily basis. So that can go from, for instance, ecosystems, what we call environmental flows, so enough water for this habitat to, survive, basically, or just to develop. Individuals, something as simple as hygiene, being able to take a shower or turn the tap and have drinking water. And societies for, developing their, to guarantee social stability and develop economic activities, for instance. And there is, I think, very much a global understanding that water security is highly dependent on forest. And as you can see here on the left, if you're familiar with the World Resource Institute, that provides a lot of very good material on this topic, like forests are definitely very important for water security for two main reasons. There is the first reason that what we call the sponge effect, like a healthy forest is able to absorb water and to store it and release it downstream, usually at a pace that we learn as human societies, to adapt to. So usually it stores water during winter, and we get the water we need during summer. And there is this second aspect of forest and water is this filter effect, like forest and forest soils especially have this ability to hold on a whole lot of compounds that can be that can turn into pollutants, toxicants, if they are just too numerous, too highly concentrated in water. So like nutrients, heavy metals, even sediments can be an issue as well. So one might say, okay, well, that's great. Like Canada has a ton of forests. It's, as you can see here on the right, a few numbers, and on the left, it's the percent forest cover for the people who are used to the hydrologic classification from down in the US. It's HUC 12 equivalent of the percent forest cover. So like each catchment here is about like 10,000 hectares. So it's pretty small. And as you can see here, well, we have definitely a lot of forest. And matter of fact, we also have a lot of water, around 20% of water resources in the world, 6% more or less of renewable fresh water in the world. So once again, one might easily think, okay, we have a ton of forest, we have a ton of water. Things must just be all right, no problem in terms of water security. Well, it's not that easy. We do face in Canada water security issues. We have many issues still to fix, like related to First Nations and Inuit communities' access to clean water. We do have issues of droughts on a regular basis, especially in the prairies where I live. Just last week, and it's going to keep going for a few weeks, probably, the issues of floods in British Columbia, here in Alberta, in southern Alberta, 2013, the Calgary floods as well. And you probably often hear about salmon-related issues, like the survival of fisheries, how they're threatened by climate change or river fragmentation. All of those questions are questions of water security. And as you can obviously already see, it's not only a matter of having forest and water, it's also a matter of how people deal with forest and water. Even further than that, World Wildlife Fund Canada has released in 2017 and 2020 what they call the Watershed reports. And that's, as far as I know, that's the most comprehensive effort to gather available water data throughout Canada. And as you can see here, like most of our watersheds, so most of Canada is, as they call it, like data deficient. We just don't have enough data to know what is the current ecological status of those watersheds. So yeah, like I guess lucky enough, most of those watersheds on which we have data, they seem to be pretty okay, but still there is population and there is like human activities and ecosystems throughout Canada. So we need to know a bit more about that as well. But then comes fire, and fire is kind of the wild card here. Why do I say it's a wild card? So in 1992, we have this common saying in fire science that pyrodiversity begets biodiversity, and what it means here is that Canada, like it applies very well to Canada because Canada is a fire-prone and fire-dependent country. I guess the forests of Canada is fire-prone and fire-dependent. What you can see here on the left is one of my colleagues at Great Lakes, Sandy Ernie, who made this map, created like based on literature modeling. What you can see here is 60 different wildfire regime units. So what is a fire regime? A fire regime is, very simply put, that's the historical fire activity in a given location. So when I say like historical fire activity, I'm thinking, typical, I guess, like average area burn, average fire intensity, fire frequency, fire season, the type of ignition. Is this human cause? Is it mostly like a lightning cause? This kind of thing. So we can divide Canada pretty much in 60 different zones. And all those zones have different, yes, fire regime, but also it means like different forest types, forest structures, just some different forests, basically, on different ecosystems. But you can also look at wildfires and the ecological role of wildfires at just the fire at the fire scale, just one fire. And here it's not very clear actually on the picture, but fire is not like what you see in the media where you have like, oh, you know, it's a moonscape, everything has been like just burned to the ground. It's actually not true. Most of the time there is like a very high diversity. It's a patchwork of varying fire severity. So here, for instance, you see a H that's high fire intensity, like that usually leads to high fire severity. Here you have medium. You see like you have an alternation of burned trees and green trees, and here you have like an unburned area. So it's actually a thalloic, but it creates like this sort of refugia. So you have both at the very like on a large extent, you have this biodiversity that creates this biodiversity. And here we have at the scale of a fire, this biodiversity as well. And so it's only logical to think, I mean, and it's my opinion, and I think a lot, I'm hopefully will agree with that. We have a fire-prone forest with a very different fire regime. So it's only logical that we also have, that it influences in very various ways, fire, watershed functioning and river biodiversity. But you can also look at this fire activity in Canada through a watershed lens. I published that last year, and it's nothing complicated at all. I just took, like the sub watershed data. I think it's equivalent to 10. It's available from the National Hydrographic Network, and I just looked at the long-term historical area burn in those watersheds, and it's pretty easy just looking at that to be like, oh, I know some of those watersheds they need the water coming from there. They have like specific aquatic habitats. Some of them might be threatened. So it's another way of looking at the problem. Once again, it's not necessarily very complicated to do. It's just like it needs to kind of shift the way we look at that. And there is plenty of data at the moment to create what I call baseline information. And I'll get back to that. So essentially, you can look at fire in Canada and how it relates to water security on like two different ways. And as we say, like in Europe, in Eastern Europe, they say fire is a good servant but a bad master. And I think that's actually kind of a global sort of traditional knowledge kind of saying as well. But so on the left here, you would have like more of the natural fire regime kind of thing. You have natural fire regime, and that maintains healthy forest and healthy forested watersheds. And so this is a way, it's obviously highly simplified, but having healthy forests, if we accept the premises that healthy forests lead to, can help protect water security, then it means that we also need good natural healthy fire regimes. On the other side, we might have anthropogenic fire regime, and it's a very, usually the way it translates in Canada, it's fire exclusion, like the Western mountains, especially, there is basically too much forest. And I'll get back to that as well. But like that's what I call an anthropogenic fire regime, at least in the context of water security, is just not enough fire in the landscape. And so you have forests that are overstocked. And then we have the fires that like the ones we've seen this past fire season in British Columbia. And that leads to water insecurity, so water security issues. And well, ideally, we want to lean on the left side of the screen here rather than the right side, but we unfortunately rather at the moment, kind of in this situation here on the right side. Okay, so that's it for kind of setting the stage for wildfires and water in Canada. And like let's get a little bit further into wildfire watershed risk. So here you see that's Cameron Falls in southern Alberta, and that's why this photo was taken right after the Keno fire in 2017. So you can see here you have like some burned forests, and usually this waterfall is just like it's blue, it's crystal blue, right? And here is just like filled with soot and ashes. So that's just give you an idea of like the sort of effect you might expect. Okay, so what do I mean by wildfire watershed risk? Well, that's a situation in which downstream location are might become vulnerable to upstream fire activity, which is, it's pretty simple, like in conceptually. But what it means is that some fires might create some changes to watershed integrity. So because it burns too hot, too big, too large, it might trigger post-fire hazards. You probably heard a lot those past few days about mudslides, flash floods, debris flow, these kind of things. But you can also have a huge impact on water availability. So how much water is going down the stream? What is the water quality as well? And so it creates a number of downstream vulnerabilities, which means that it's very much what we call a cascading risk. And it's the idea of cascading risk is something that's been growing in the scientific literature lately. But in the case of wildfire watershed risk, we can think of a primary risk that is like borne by watersheds. How much those watersheds are exposed, resistant, and resilient to fire, and obviously how much then, in a second time, those watersheds are important for downstream needs, downstream supply. So once again, that can be for ecosystems, or for societies. And those cascading effects can be seen, as you see, like on the left here. You can think about those things through time and space. It's not only like, okay, a small catchment is burning and you're looking like directly downstream. The amount of science that is being done in this field, like especially for those past, I guess in Canada for past 10 years, but if you think about the US, it's been pretty much half a century now. They've been working on that, starting from issues at the really hill slope scale and how it might impact small stream reaches, to what it means increasingly. Like we have those, like we want to know what it means for ecosystem services, and in the end, we want to know how it might impact the functioning of society, or the functioning of what we call hydrosystems, and eventually how it might impact global water resources. A few years ago, somebody down in the US published the results of a global modeling effort suggesting that wildfires may be responsible for around 14% of global water budget variations, which is like not negligible, right? So yes, that's the way we can approach wildfire watershed risk. And what happens, really, like when we have a fire, how does it materialize? How the problem does materialize? Well, I guess we can, I can put that just in a nutshell, like in a very short recipe. You need, usually we agree that around 20% of the watershed burn at medium to high severity, followed by extreme rainfall, and if maybe like too heavy, snowfall, is the best. It's the best recipe for disaster. Usually, that's the kind of settings that will lead to downstream issues. And what are those issues? Well, when you have a fire and that burns all the vegetation, you will have an increase in the amount of water reaching the ground. So we'll have more runoff with higher velocity, with higher erosive power as well. And it's going to get the soil, but also all those toxicants that I was talking earlier in my introduction. It's going to get all those toxicants with it and like go down the watershed and go downstream, follow the network, and eventually reach a number of places where you're going to see an increase in sediments, an increase in nutrients. A number of those nutrients might cause harmful algal blooms, actually can be just more generally just toxic to aquatic ecosystems and people. You can have an increase in heavy metals, like mercury is especially of concern here, and you can have increased precipitation. The increased precipitation can be of concern for aquatic habitats, but also in some respect to drinking water supply as well. But what is the state of our knowledge in Canada? That's a question I asked myself a couple of years ago, and we published that last year with my colleagues. And it entails Alaska as well. But so what it shows here is the number of studies on the wildfire watershed risks I was able to find since 1980. And I only found 82. I guess like with the few that have been published, and if you want to go into like some peatland, post-fire eco-hydrology, let's say like we could maybe add like So some more of those studies, and I don't know, reach up to 150 studies scattered throughout Canada. But if you think about the size of our country, and if you think about the previous maps I showed on forests, on water, like the areas where we lack water data, well, we still have a lot of work ahead, right? Which leads me to this idea of how can we move forward? How could we address like all those gaps, what you've seen on the map, but also what we've seen, what you can easily find, like in terms of gaps in the literature. And so I think something we should start with is thinking about what I call the fire regime of fresh waters. Maybe that could be a good title for a book. Let's see, maybe in 20 years from now. But what I mean here is that we have in Canada enough data to start working on that. Like, I guess like all of you have probably heard like, oh, like, we need more data for that. Like, we are in an era of big data. We always need more data. But I mean, I increasingly disagree with that in the sense that it leaves a whole lot of data resources on the side, and that I think we should actually work with to provide what I call this baseline information. I'll just leave you read this quote here in a couple of seconds. And I just wanted to add this this quote here in this idea of like the fire regime of fresh waters, just because I think I've been reading more and more about river science, river ecology, and aquatic restoration, these kind of things. And I just have the feeling that river scientists and aquatic ecologists, they have a much better understanding of the role of terrestrial upstream terrestrial disturbances and how they impact downstream water resources. And I think that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. And this idea of like producing this baseline information, really essentially what it is just to look at fire through a watershed lens. And I showed this map already, but that's really what it is. And we could go so much deeper. Like it's my intent to do so much more with that, like time series analysis, like changes in area burn at a watershed scale, either at the sub watershed scale, but we can also think about like larger basins. But anyways, I guess my point is just to say, well, we do have the data to do that. Here, that's an example from the US, but that's something that would be pretty easy to reproduce here in Canada. It's around 9,000 lakes. And they created a buffer around those lakes, and they looked at, historical area burn, just to get some sense of, okay, how might those lakes be influenced by historical fire activity? Do they have like an actual characteristic fire regime that would match a characteristic lake functioning style, type? So once again, we do have that. We can do that in Canada. We do have much more lakes, but we do have the data to get this kind of insight as well. And something we can do as well is to go even further and look at our hydrometric recalls. We do have, through a Water Survey of Canada, a number of gauges. I think there are like 7,000 active and historical gauges. And we can access, it's public, it's not necessarily easy to find, but we have watersheds for around 1,700 of those gauges. You see like the coverage is not optimal when it comes to overlapping that with wildfire activity. But my point here is that we even have enough information for water and fire that we can start to look at how, like really on a, I guess like statistical type of analysis or hydrostatistical type of analysis, we can really start to look at how those historical fires since pretty much the 1980s have influenced and mediated downstream hydrological regimes. So as I said, we do have enough information. Right now, I've started a project where I'm looking at wildfires in Western hydrological regimes. Why do I focus there? Is because the Western mountains are what we call a water tower. So it supplies water for nearly 10 million people. So this is why I want to have a clearer idea of how those watersheds might be influenced by wildfires through time series analysis. Because in the end, what I want to do is like, hopefully I'll be able to typecast those watersheds. What I mean by that is say, okay, like this type of watershed has this type of fire regime. which so it burns that often at this kind of severity. And that's usually the kind of hydrological response we might expect and the time it's going to take for the watershed to recover. And why is that important? Well, you know, a lot of people are responsible for water management, watershed management, and they do need this information, in particular when they are affiliated to you know, drinking water supply. Because drinking water supply, yes, there is an issue of quality, but an issue of availability as well. But here on this picture, here on the left, that's the Fort McMurray drinking water plant. You can see here that there is still like some remnants of the fire, the 2016 Horse River fire, and I had the chance to visit them just the fall right after the fire, and that's quite the story they have. You know, they refused to evacuate. They wanted to keep the water running for firefighters. It's got very emotional and stuff. That was something very, very crazy. So what I mean here is that it's not only it impacts people, and they do value the type of topic and possible I guess kind of things scientists can do, because yes, wildfires can definitely impact drinking water supplies, and it's something we it is I guess like the main reference at the moment when it comes to wildfires, drinking water supply, and management of source watersheds. It's in Denver, Colorado. I guess Colorado as a whole, but Denver really after the Hammond fire in 2002, like it was a hassle for them to really like be able to provide water, drinking water to almost like over 2 million people. It's dozens of millions of dollars in cleaning, in and they set up an active forest management program that is very, very interesting. So I really invite you to go and see like what Denver has done in their source watersheds. I just mentioned the Horse Creek fire in 2016. On several occasions, the water treatment plant had to shut down the pipes so they wouldn't get polluted water, so fire polluted water in their system. And so far, because of the issues in raw water quality, they had to spend $10 million, pretty much $10 million in extra cost. And for a small community, $10 million is a lot of money. And finally, Sydney, here you can see we did that on the, like we published that last February, looking at the fires in Australia, and here overlapped is the municipal watersheds. And yeah, over half of those drinking water, like source watersheds for drinking water for Sydney and Canberra were burned to some extent, and they're still dealing with some issues that can some pretty heavy duty reservoir management. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of like what is the perfect like worst case scenario, it's that those fires that were extensive and severe, as you can see as well here, a lot of red in terms of fire severity, they were followed by record-breaking precipitation. And you can once again find a lot of pictures about like, yeah, the army getting in with like some mobile water treatment plants and stuff like that. So definitely an important question. Why is that? Well, I won't go through that, and it's not that important. What is important here is like it's a list of all those water treatment type of actions that can be impacted by changes in raw water quality. Most of in raw water quality. But what is important here is like you see that the only one that check all the boxes, I guess, it's operating costs. Why that? Because usually, as I mentioned just earlier, when you have like fires, usually water treatment costs get much higher, and in the end, that will be for taxpayers to bear the costs, like to pay the bill. So on the long run, it should be it provides support to more upstream active management, fire management in source watershed. So taxpayers and I guess like people would just drink water and in the end don't have to pay more because of poor forest or I guess not the most poor forest or poor fire management upstream. And another increasing issue we have comes from what we call interface fires. Maybe some of you are familiar with the concept of wild and urban interface, and we have specific type of fires in those interfaces. And because we do have a lot of houses and just a lot of human-made type of things that are made of plastic, including water pipes. The combustion of plastic generates a lot of benzene, and benzene is a carcinogenic compound. And when it gets into the pipes, it can be very, very hard to remove. And those are pictures from a fire in California a few years ago. I don't remember the place exactly, but it's going to cost them $350 million to clean that over the next 5 years, I think, or something like that. So like that's estimates, but just to give you another idea of, once again, as a taxpayer, you know, if you don't have to pay that, that's kind of better. I mean, we can find ways to not have to pay for these kind of things, I guess. So what do we do? What do we do to avoid what I just described? That can be pretty dire, and like nobody wants to have to deal with that. We go through what we call source water protection. So source water protection, that's a number of actions, regulation that can be set up to address threats to drinking water sources. So threats can be very diverse. In this very case, that's wildfires. And source water protection, that's the first stage of what we call the multi-barrier approach to safe drinking water. So I won't go through the detail of what it means, what the multi-barrier approach means, but really this idea is to say, okay, like the first step we have to do is like to map those watersheds and to get an idea of, in this case, wildfire, what is the threat that wildfire represents to downstream drinking water. So what do? It's a watershed assessment. What you see here on the left, that's something where we did for Alberta. We were able to gather the location of drinking water treatment plants and to create those watersheds. And we went through a multi-criteria evaluation approach to get some sort of an index of the exposure of those source watersheds to forest fires. And you see like the one on the left is the original one. And you see that here close to Calgary, those watersheds definitely are highly exposed around Fort McMurray, around Grand Prairie as well. So it's interesting. Edmonton, it's kind of halfway on the exposure scale. That's the kind of things, you know, that can really of really interest. Actually, EPCOR, which is like the water provider in Edmonton, we've been chatting for a while after this the publication of this work, because that's really the kind of things that are of interest to them. But that's like this work here, that was not open data. You remember I was talking about baseline information, and a major aspect of producing this baseline information is to be able to access open data. And right now I have a paper that it's the second round of reviews, and that should be up, you know, pretty soon. And here in Canada, you have access to what we call municipal watersheds only for 3 provinces: BC, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, Labrador. And many of those municipal watersheds have burned. Actually, this one is not actualized to the 2021 fire season. There would be probably a few more around here. But I guess my point here, like in orange, you see the fire history since 1980. I guess my point here is that I wish I could do that for the entire country and be able to have this kind of simple type of statistics being, oh yeah, you know, throughout all the municipal watershed of Canada, that's the kind of fire statistics that I can provide and that are of importance to drinking water suppliers. So I decided to fix that. And so what I've been doing right now, what you see on the left here, actually, I'm done creating this data set. That's all the municipal water licenses of Canada. And I say municipal because it's not always for drinking water, but most of the time it is. And I created that, part of them were provided, were open access. Some of them I had to create them myself on Nunavut, for instance. And the idea here is to recreate and adapt what is called the forest to faucets approach. So that's something that comes from the US. That's a fairly simple product that was created over 10 years ago, and that is really well known down in the US. They just released the second version, and basically what this product does is it connects municipal water demand to upstream forests and the amount of water coming from those forests. And then you start to add wildfire hazard it's very much a multi-criteria evaluation type of approach as well here. And my intent is to create, yes, a Canada-wide source-to-tap mapping or forest to faucets. I guess like in Canada, we say source-to-tap in the like official documents. Why do I want to do that? You know, besides like the interest and like the, I guess like in terms of coding and like spatial analysis, like what is interesting is that it will give me the opportunity to create a benchmark. And once again, this idea of creating this baseline information, I will be able to create a reference, so benchmark, and then I can start to play around with like, oh, what if climate change? What if more like, you know, increase in water demand? What if more forest fires? And so I can really start to provide interesting insights and hopefully come up with some priorities in terms of, oh, where are those catchments where we really need to act in terms of source water protection? All of that, you know, like when I'm talking about finding some priorities and like hopefully being able to make a move on those watersheds to better manage them. And I know like my title here is a bit provocative, but how do we, instead of looking at what we've been doing for almost 1 century in terms of fire management in Canada, based on fire exclusion, aggressive suppression, maybe we should start to look at the problem in a different manner and be like, okay, like instead of looking at wildfire as a foe, maybe it can actually be a friend. And remember in this in my introduction, like you can look at the right side of the watershed. Wildfires can be a good servant and be a valuable tool for water security. As I mentioned already several times, and actually quite ironically, on the eastern slope, so like on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, one of the reasons for aggressive fire suppression and fire exclusion in the early 20th century was to protect water. Like at the moment, at this time, that was to protect the water for irrigation. But you know, after more than a century, we realized that that was not working. It actually makes it worse for water. And why that? Well, because of forest encroachment. You can see here that's a picture of 1914, I think, and here it's like 2014 or 2016. And there is just much more trees. And by the way, they're all burned. But I really invite you to look at the Mountain Legacy Project. I think it's led by Eric Higgs at the University of Victoria. It's very interesting. And one of my colleagues at the Canadian Forest Service, he published this work a couple of years ago, looking at changes in fire activity, in fire regime, when you basically, you run fire regime models with this kind of landscape, and you ran fire regime models with this kind of landscape. You don't really see that here, but that's basically the 4 kind of essential maps getting out of his work. But really, you don't have a huge changes in wildfire probability, but you have a significant change in wildfire severity. And remember what I said is that fire severity is a very big component of post-fire hydrological functioning. So like and also what he found is like, you know, fires, if I remember correctly, there was not like a huge difference in like fire sizes, but you were like, when a fire would burn, usually more of this area would be burned at high severity. So my point here, and I'm just trying to piggyback on what he did and to connect that, to use his outputs as inputs for a hydrological model, actually hydrological and water quality model. I'd like to try to work with SWAT Plus for some of the people here who are modelers. I think I saw James Craig, so I'm sure he knows what I'm talking about. And my point here, and that can actually be a bit, you know, some people might disagree with that, that too much forest is basically not good for water. It's not good for fire, but it's also not good for water. And so, as I said, yeah, I want to compare using a modeling approach, pre-suppression type of hydrology, post-suppression as well, and start to play with the amount of fire there is in the landscape, and use what we call indicators of hydrological alteration. So I won't go into what IHAs mean, but it's I think it's 60 indicators that have been used commonly to look at the impact of dams on the functioning of waterways. But here I want to use the same kind of approach, but to look at fire suppression as the disturbance, not fire itself. And my hope is that I can provide some arguments to support fire regime restoration. Fire regime restoration could be seen as a nature-based solution. And there is increasing amount of literature as well showing that nature-based solutions are much cheaper and probably more efficient than human-based solutions. And remember, like for the kind of values, costs you saw for drinking water issues post-fire, it's like, oh, maybe if we actually use fire, which is probably the cheapest tool in the world for landscape management, maybe we can actually save some more money at the same time as we protect water security. And I want to go even further than that in terms of, I mentioned watershed rewilding, and I think that a big actor of that is it's beaver, like big actor is beaver, and it's really gaining traction down in the US. How to use beaver, for watershed restoration and wildfire mitigation, and you can see here that's the bootleg fire, so that's this past summer, and you see it's all burned, but here in the middle, you have this patch. It's a beaver complex. It's all green, and like they're starting really in the US to build pretty cool, good evidence and pretty cool evidence. I'm very enamored with beavers. It's such a cool animal, and well, lucky enough, we have a ton in the boreal forest. And here, this is a picture that was taken right after the Fort McMurray fire in 2016. And here, you see like 1, 2, 3. There are 4 beaver dams here, and if you're interested, I can explain more what you can see here. But here you have like pretty high fire severity, and then you get closer to the beaver dam complex, and yeah, you have some spots that have burned, but overall, it looks much better. And so my idea, we started a project. I mean, maybe this one is more at the inception stage at the moment, but down in the US, they looked at fire perimeters and where they would find spots, like basically green spots, and usually it would correlate pretty well with beaver activity. What I want to do in northern Alberta is to look at to take a step back, look at that from a higher elevation, I guess, altitude, and I want to know if there is like some sort of emerging property of the landscape when there are so many beavers, so many beaver dam complex, and so much more water stored in the landscape. Does it actually impact fire regimes? So basically comparing small watersheds and like with different beaver dam density and historical fire activity. Do we see differences? Especially, and I think it's valuable, well, for 2 things. The first one is Canada used to be, and the US as well, used to be really covered by beavers. Like if you read like some accounts of like the first European explorers, it was more like a swamp rather than like crystal blue pristine rivers. So it was very, very different. So I guess like it's interesting in this respect, but also can we also use beavers as a nature-based solution? So once again, cheap but also useful and for wildfire disaster risk reduction. Let's imagine, for instance, like not necessarily reintroducing, but trying to make it easier for beavers, for instance, to reach some places around communities, and maybe it can be natural, fire breaks, just because, well, water doesn't burn. And I will say, quite frankly, come on, beavers are pretty cute, very huge sympathy capital. All right. Well, with that, I'm reaching the end of my talk here. Here, that's just an example. That's Upper Kananaskis Lake, and it's typical example of what you can like resulting from wildfire exclusion. It's like you have very nice water and you have a ton of forest here, but it's conifer forest, and once again overstocked and very prime for burning, unfortunately. But I can't finish this talk without talking about global environmental change. Obviously, climate change. Many of my colleagues at the Canadian Forest Service, that's what they work on. And the future is looking pretty dire. And I'm not talking like I'm talking a few decades from now only. Like fire activity is really going to get worse and worse. We also have at the same time decreasing water availability. So we're going to have less water coming from our source watersheds. At the same time as well, we're going to have more people demanding water, as well as more people in the landscape that are going to be exposed to fire, that are going to generate human-caused ignitions as well. And finally, we're going to have more extreme precipitation. Remember, again, this recipe, like fire, more fire, extreme fires, and followed by extreme precipitation. That's what's going to cause like more and more troubles. Like, unfortunately, that is, this is slowly, or maybe not that slowly actually, but it's leading more and more to those wildfire watershed risk situations. And finally, you know, Canada is a signatory of the Sustainable Development Goals, and wildfire watershed risk really like check the boxes for goal 6. Yeah, I think that yeah, like 6 and 15, like for water and for forests. And parallel to the SDGs is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and which Canada is also a signatory of this agreement, and that has been translated through the emergency management strategy for Canada, which is what I work for. You know, specifically, I was hired within the mandate of the emergency management strategy for Canada. But you might ask, okay, so how do we go from baseline knowledge to sustainable action? And, you know, I hope I was able to convey something that was, to convey the fact that I was talking about something that was a logical progression. You would start with talking about wildfire watershed risk, what it is, what it entails. So like essentially risk literacy. And then once you have that, when you start to spread the word, well, what can we do about it? You know, and in terms of simple baseline information, so we can communicate about the topic. And once we communicate about the topic, you know, we get some awareness, and maybe some people start to connect the dots and be like, okay, maybe we should do something in our watersheds, either because they provide drinking water, either because there is an endangered habitat. It's like, okay, let's talk about source water protection then and see like what we can do, and maybe prioritize some watersheds for action, where you're going to end up here and be like, okay, let's run some you know, models and see what we can do, maybe in terms of fire regime restoration, or I guess I'm not a big fan of the word restoration, but maybe renaturation of watersheds. And is it affordable? Is it doable? Can we go even further than that and like think about some rewilding and like some other nature-based solution that can really help us to both keep fire in the landscape, but also provide natural fuel treatment and mitigation options. And once we have all this knowledge, let's put it to a test and see how it holds against global environmental change, and then do it again. So yes, I guess I came full circle, and I'm hopeful that was that made sense. I will only, instead of having like a long list of references, you can go, and that's the paper that was published last February, and that covers pretty much this whole talk. And that also contains a lot of references as well. And with that, if you want to talk, if you agree, disagree, you want to collaborate, you just want to chat, then please shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to get into a conversation with you. You can follow me on Twitter. And so yes, with that, thank you. Merci. And I wish I could speak Salish and say thank you in this language, but I hope there are people in the audience from First Nations, or people who have knowledge of First Nation, and hopefully they can provide me with some insights here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. That's an excellent presentation. You cover quite a few aspects of wildfire, and it's really informative. Now I'd like to invite some questions. And Graham? Or Emily? Emily, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Francois, for that presentation. That was super interesting. I just had a question about using prescribed burns. So I know that you mentioned those have like a lot of potential as a nature-based solution, but I also know that they're used a lot like today, like I know in Banff National Park and stuff like that. And so that got me wondering like what your thoughts on, or like where the science is on prescribed burns right now. Like how much do we really know about like what a certain burn will do? And kind of like where is there room for improvement in understanding how prescribed burns can be used?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. When it comes to specifically to water, prescribed burns, based on the evidence we have at the moment, like hardly have any effect. I mean, hardly. It's maybe too strong of a word, but at least the effect that they have is, I would say, like fairly easily manageable, and doesn't get to some sort of a tipping point in terms of impacts to aquatic habitats or drinking water treatment or things like that. So, but when I say prescribed burn, I have in mind this kind of low intensity fires just to clear the underbrush. But it's not necessarily the type of fires that you will see everywhere in terms of prescribed burns. I know Parks Canada have done some prescribed burns that are pretty high intensity and pretty large as well. And I actually don't know if they do any sort of, I know they do post-fire monitoring in terms of vegetation. I don't know if they do anything in terms of, water, either before setting the burn or after the fire, if they go look into, any sort of a problem. So I guess the potential is here, and because once again we know usually like the way we visualize, the way we see prescribed burns, it has a lot of potential because usually it does not produce like the same like unmanageable impacts.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And just by if you want to know more about that, you can look at in Europe the oh god, I work with those people and I forgot the name of their project. But there is ongoing right now, led by the which I think it's Utrecht University in the Netherlands, by Kathleen Stoof. Like she works a lot on prescribed burns, low intensity fires, and she shows that there can be some effects. Once again, there is a matter of scale here that can be of importance.
Thank you.
More questions? John?
Well, sort of a tangential question. I've always been interested in mercury in waters in Canada, and you mentioned mercury. I saw mercury mentioned a couple of times. I know that flooding river valleys tends to create mercury issues in reservoirs. But what do wildfires do? What is this relationship between wildfire and mercury?
Yeah, that's a good question. So usually when it burns, so in Canada, for instance, I think that was a paper published not so long ago that showed that forests in Canada have accumulated a lot of man-made mercury, and that tends to be released during fires. A lot of mercury usually goes up in the smoke, and actually, but the problem is then it gets deposited afterwards. So if you look at the proportions of, like, how much mercury remains underground to how much mercury after a fire is just, goes up in smoke, you're gonna have much less mercury running off, like getting eroded and like going downstream in lakes or rivers and reservoirs. That said, there is a great paper of 2006 that really showed in the Rocky Mountains on our side, I guess I say our, in Alberta, that showed that through biological accumulation, you can actually reach mercury levels in predatory fish that is above health guidelines. And this is something to keep in mind, because still a lot of First Nations, they use fish as their primary source of proteins. And then we're starting to have a couple of nice papers looking at the mercury from smoke deposition, and which is something, probably a big next step. But it will take a lot of modeling, and as well as like some probably some sediment coring. But at the moment, I can't really speak to that because, yeah, in Canada, we haven't done that much. We just had like a recent paper that looked at smoke deposition signal, not with mercury, but at least like they were able to show that it can significantly change the chemical properties of water, even though the fire, like there was no fire nearby. So I guess I'm hopeful it's going to come in the years, in the next few years, and I will be able to tell you more about mercury from smoke deposition.
Thank you very much.
There's a question from the chat from Monica. I think she asked, can you explain why the boreal forests are now becoming carbon sinks?
Oh wow, that's a lot of questions for Monica. I can see them, and I can try my best to answer that. Although this is a bit on the side of my of what I do, but regenerating with different species, that's a good question, and I think you might be referring to assisted migration and these kind of things here. I guess in my mind, when I'm talking about wildfire regime, once again, I will use restoration by lack of a better word. I think we should start by seeing, like, you know, just waiting to see how nature reacts by like natural, you know, it just I think before talking about like trying to, like, you know, I don't know, like thinking about having a prescribed burn and after this burn, you know, planting new species, I'm like, well, why not? But I think at the moment we should first try to see, just to try to put fire back in the system and see how the system reacts. I think that's the way to go at the moment, because if really there is some, like those past few years, you know, when all this literature about nature-based solutions, like something that really comes up quite often is just nature is usually the best at doing the job. So I think that's wise. So that would be my answer to that. Why is the boreal forest becoming carbon sink? Well, because it burns, because it burns a whole lot, and because I think a big aspect of why it's becoming a carbon sink is related to peatlands, because like the boreal forest is not only the boreal forest, but a huge part of Canada is covered by peatlands, and peatlands are natural carbon. Not carbon sinks, but carbon sources. So they are carbon sinks, and they are becoming carbon sources because they're burning, because they are thawing, and when they thaw, when they're melting, there is also like degradation that is happening as well, so releasing a whole lot of carbon and other and methane. So this is why. This is very much because of, well, climate change, and in some parts where we have more fire than we would have naturally, it's also because of, you know, human-made fire exclusion. So this is the reason why it's becoming carbon sources, at least in part. Just we have more fires and we have more fuel available for those fires. Oh yeah, and fire retard, wildland fire retardant. So what I can say about fire retardants is usually they are based on, I think it's phosphorus based. I think I'm not a firefighter myself, but I think, yeah, it's mostly, there are a lot of phosphorus compounds, and they can actually, I've come across, I read a few impacts, like localized impact, you know, not saying that it's good because it's localized, and it can definitely lead to increase in nutrients that could potentially lead to eutrophication. It's a few things that I've read. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's a understudied topic, really. So yes, it can cause harm, and there are evidence of local effects. How much can it change, I don't know, aquatic habitats functioning, and how much it can impact water security at large? I don't know, and that's actually a question that came not so long ago as well from a member of the public that was addressed to Natural Resources of Canada, and we tried to answer our best, but it's like, well, once again, it's hard right now just because we don't have hard results on that.
Thank you for that. And I think I should have said sources.
Yes.
The boreal forest was the sources of carbon, not sinks. That's right. And the other question I have as well too, and I don't mean to hog it all, but the devastation caused by the forest fires in Ontario this year, that definitely affects the root systems. Is there recovery from any of those root systems? Because we know how they're all interconnected, and how they feed each other with the soil biomes and that. So it's you can't separate one from the other.
No, you can't. So it will depend, you know, like, so there is a distinction that I didn't want to make in the presentation to not, you know, give too many details, but we distinguish fire severity from burn severity. And so you can actually have vegetation that it's gone, and you can be like, oh, that's high fire severity, but then like the soil might not have been like that impacted. So like the depth of burn has not been that bad. So a good part of, you know, like the soil ecosystem might just still be in place, including roots. And there are a lot of vegetation, a lot of species, they adapted to that. So like, you know, they will actually just resprout. But you have different strategies, post-fire strategies for different type of vegetation to regrow after a fire. So some of them will totally die, like some pines, for instance. Pines do not resprout, but they have serotinous, or spruce, or like pine and spruce both. They have serotinous cones, which means that once you have heat, they will just open, and that's the new seeds that will just germinate. And they need like a clear, open land with a lot of sun to actually to grow. So I guess my point here is like it will depend on burn severity, so how deep the soil was burned, and it will also depend on the species you're talking about, because they all have different strategies to react after a fire.
Miigwech, thank you. That's Miigwech in Ojibwe. That's thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we have like I like to suggest like 2 more questions, and I start with Yin, and then Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, my question for Francois. So first of all, great presentation. I'm tempted to ask about the floods, but I won't. But
well, you can. I've been talking to reporters this week, so you know, just I have some answers for you.
Okay. Well, the first question I have is in regards to water quality testing. Do you think that the cabin protocol, the federal cabin invertebrate protocol, is a good way to measure, you know, wildfire water quality, or what kinds of things do you recommend looking for there?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking this question. Like, so in this talk, I referred to this this paper that I have in review, and like I used like 2 different maps, and not the third one, in which I analyzed kind of superficially, but the cabin data set, because I think it would be great to use that. Unfortunately, the overlap between cabin and past historical fire activity is not that great, if to not say highly limited. That said, I like the protocol, and what I suggest in the manuscript is that maybe that we could think of it some sort of not necessarily an evolution of the protocol, but maybe the cabin people at the I think that's the River Institute, maybe can also try to get into their the way to select sites, be like, oh, maybe we should try to connect to some, you know, sites that have burned, maybe like just right upstream in the burn and just downstream of the burn. And I think that would be a very cool evolution, because they do take water quality samples, but also they have a lot of things about like, yeah, microinvertebrates. And that would be, I think there is a lot of potential for the cabin protocol to evolve to better capture water and wildfires in Canada. That's for sure.
So do you think it could work as kind of a before and after for prescribed burns, for instance?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for prescribed burns, yes, because like when it comes to just fires, like fires is like, you know, it's stochastic. It's you have before and after when you are lucky. But for prescribed burns, absolutely, I really think that it's a great idea, actually.
Okay, and Simon?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, and it's nice to meet you, Dr. Robinne. So I'm a graduate student. I'm working with Dr. James Craig and
Oh, yes.
Dr. Nandita Basu. I work very much day to day with hydrologic models. And I was just wondering, with respect to the fire regime predictions that you talked about by Stockdale, your colleague.
Oh, Chris Stockdale, yes.
Yeah, and I was just wondering along those lines, what kind of work do you think needs to be done to water quality and water quantity models now in preparation for incorporating the outputs from such kinds of predictions?
Oh, that's a very cool question. So that's it's a very cool question. We had one of my colleagues, Kevin Bladen, down in Oregon State University. He published a couple of years ago something with using SWAT, and really at the moment it's kind of a nightmare because there is no easy way to translate post-fire changes to I guess for vegetation it's okay, but the bigger thing is like changes to soil structure. It's and sediment and nutrient, other heavy metal accessibility. And I think, and especially in Canada, because we have so many issues with soil data, I think down the road, what we need at the moment, well, first it's better soil data, but it's also being able, once we have a fire, either a real fire or like fire outputs from a model, we're able to translate that easily into some changes to the soil structure, soil composition. I think at the moment that's really, and soil hydraulic connectivity and a lot of the things like that. And to me, that's top priority, like being able to easily translate those things into like changes to soil.
Got it. Yeah. Just reconciling those scale differences and even units in the
and yes,
frameworks.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a major undertaking, and like, and this in the US, they're still like actively working on that. You probably know Brian Abel, like the kind of work he's done.
Yeah.
He works at this very like micro scale. He wants to know those changes between like water movement between particles and things that I don't even understand. But that's the kind of things we need to know to, once again, translate our fire models into hydrological and water quality models for sure.
Got it. Yeah, it reminds me a lot about Robbie Show's work.
Pete,
yeah, with his FS WEP model, where he predicts soil water erosion.
Exactly. Yes, the web model is great, but fortunately and unfortunately, the problem with the US is that that's great because they create everything in an integrated fashion. They have the source data, they developed a model based on the soil they have. In the US, in Canada, we're trying right now to see how we can import some of those models, and the SWAT model that we've tried, and it's hard. It's hard because it's all set up for American data. And it's definitely it's kind of hard to adapt that, but it's the way to go. And I'm really hoping. I know like you guys work with developed Raven software, and I would love to use a Canadian model for all those things I'm doing. So keep up the great work, guys.
Right. Thanks for your insights. Appreciate your time.
Very welcome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And Francois, that's an excellent presentation, and the answers to some questions. And it's really useful and informative. I really enjoy like some like phrases you use, like about the wildfire, the servant, the good servant, but the could be like bad monk. I think the philosophically, I think fire like is part of our landscape. It's a part of nature, and actually even our BC interior, there's some forests like particular logical pine forests depend on fire.
Absolutely.
We call like a fire maintaining system. And but another side, like because of the fire like cycle land, cycle forest, also cycle aquatic system. And but our policy, like fire suppression policy, continue to build fuels, actually create more opportunity for more fire and more severe fire in the future. So I think I'm kind of challenge to us, like how can break that kind of cycle? We keep suppression, we build more fuels and more fire in the future, and also you argue about the too much forest is not good. That's actually quite a big statement.
Oh, I know. I stand by it. I know that a lot of people don't like, especially like if you go like for larger audiences, maybe non-scientific audiences, they might be like, "Are you out of your mind?"
But this is like all like kind of issue like come back to us like more about like how can we work with nature? We cannot really fight the fire because it's just part of nature, right? The question is like our human activity, we change the climate, actually we change the fire regimes, and we change everything. So this is challenges questions to us.
Yes, it is absolutely, and I really do think that I hope with this kind of talk and this topic, like it's such a broad topic, and there are so many things that to talk about and to do, but I think increasingly, as I said, I'm reading about, like watershed, like rewilding, watershed restoration, and how we can, like usually river scientists and aquatic ecologists, they think about floods or dams most of the time when it comes to upstream disturbances. But increasingly, I think like I want to use their knowledge and like see how we could fit fire into that. And I think, yes, as you said, working with nature, working with fire, and like having this, I think it's a bit maybe, it's not that obvious for a lot of people that you can protect water by having more fires. Just like you need the better kind of fire. Right.
Okay, and thank you again, like on behalf of the committee, like really much appreciate talking to us, and we are keeping in touch in the future.
Yes.